We just had a little tiny glitch, so we'll be starting now. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here on our final OUFC webinar. Jacqueline Scott is here today to speak to us about Into the Woods, a Black Perspective. Thank you, Jacqueline, for speaking today. I would like to begin by acknowledging that we are meeting on land that has been inhabited by Indigenous people from the beginning. The Ontario Urban Forest Council has members who work and practice throughout Ontario, which is covered by 46 treaties, but most of our team is speaking to you from Toronto, and we wish to acknowledge the ancestral traditional territories of the Ojibwa, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, Wendat, and in particular the Mississaugas of the New Credit, whose territory we are gathered on. We recognize and deeply appreciate their historic and ongoing connection to Toronto. We recognize that Métis, Inuit, and other Indigenous peoples have made contributions. We recognize and deeply appreciate their historic and ongoing connection to Toronto. We recognize that Métis, Inuit, and other Indigenous peoples have made contributions to shaping and strengthening this community in particular, and our province and country as a whole. The Toronto Territory is covered by 13 treaties in the Upper Canada section, and as settlers, we acknowledge that Indigenous peoples must also be clearly and overtly connected to our collective commitment. Now, I'll introduce Jacqueline. Jacqueline Scott is a PhD student whose research is on how to make outdoor recreation and environmentalism accessible for Black people. She is a keen outdoor enthusiast. She leads hikes and bike rides for outdoor clubs and community organizations. Jacqueline has featured many articles on how race intersects with environmentalism and the outdoors. Her work has been critical to Toronto's diversity and inclusion education. Jacqueline.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks Sadia, Janani, and John for inviting me to do the webinar. Okay, so today's presentation, I've called it Into the Woods, a Black Perspective. Now, my research was prompted by trying to understand why I met so few other Black people in all my decades of doing outdoor recreation. So whether it was hiking, camping, canoeing, snowshoeing, 99% of the time, I was the only Black person. So I wanted to find out why. The research is relevant because outdoor recreation is often a gateway activity to the broader environmentalism, forestry, conservation, ecology, and of course, the ongoing climate crisis discussions. And it's topical because around about this time last year, the incident in Central Park with Christian Cooper, a Black man birdwatching, where he was threatened with the police being called on him by a white woman. Now, the incident around Christian Cooper was heightened because around about the same time, we had Breonna Taylor being murdered by the police. We had George Floyd being murdered by the police. So conversations around race were forefront. And here was Christian Cooper with a calling, threatened with being called by the police. And if the police had arrived, who knows what could have happened. That was last year. A year later, around about the same time, we are still talking about justice for George Floyd. And once again, race awareness conversations around race are heightened because of that. And of course, because of the pandemic as well, which has encouraged people of color to go explore outdoors. And I'll pick up a little bit more on how race intersects with that. So in this presentation, the focus is on the Black experience in outdoor recreation, in the woods or in the wilderness or in the wildlands. Now, my research is built on 3 pillars, and these are race, place, and nature. And what I'm looking at is how do they intersect in Canada? Now, in nature, the birds, the trees, the rivers, all of those are real. The weather is real. However, how we relate to them is socially constructed. And what I mean by that is that our views of nature reflect the power and the relationships in our society. Now in Canada, I'm sure you've all heard, we are the land of the great white north. We are the land of the great outdoors. We are the north. So much of our sense of ourselves as a country and our myths, our nationalist myths, are determined by the geography of the country. Yet, when we think about the wilderness in Canada, is the wilderness natural or is it man made? Because in Canada, so much of our outdoor recreation activities occur in the conservation areas, the provincial parks, or the national park system. And yet, still, these were created by dispossessing Indigenous people of their land. And in Toronto, we're covered by Treaty 13. And in the narratives of outdoor recreation and preserving the pristine wilderness, historically, it was white people who were seen as the guardian of this pristine wilderness. And historically, outdoor recreation was a way for people, white people, to reconnect to nature. And it was seen as an antidote to the sissifying effects of city life. When we think of those nationalist myths of Canada, the land of the great outdoors, the land of the great white north, we the north, who is present in those images? And just as importantly, who is absent? In those images, in those myths, white people are present, and the group that is noticeable by its absence is Black people. And the absence of Black people is about how race shapes how we see nature, who is wanted in nature settings, and who is seen as a surprise when they show up. As I said earlier, the park system was created by dispossessing Indigenous people of their land. And within the national park system and the provincial park system, there are so many Indigenous communities which are nearby, which are just beside the park boundaries. But most of the time, you would never know that by looking at the signage, the maps, the brochures, or the postcards that you see in those parks. And the wilderness in the Canadian imagination, it's a place to recuperate. And it's also a place to perform what we call white masculinities, the idea of the ideal man in the woods, and later on, white femininity. And on the slide, I have a picture of Tobermory National Park. And we were hiking up there last summer, and much to our surprise, there was a huge amount of people of color. Now, Tobermory is a long way from Toronto, and so of course, I saw a group of Black people, and I had to go and ask them, how did they find out about the park? And their response was they were bored, didn't know what to do in Toronto, wanted to escape the crowds, and Google Maps says, go to Tobermory, and that's where they went hiking. And on the trails that day, we saw so many people of colors, not your traditional hikers, not remotely wearing your traditional hiking gear, but they were out, I think it was a Saturday afternoon because it was bright and sunny, and they were discovering the national park system. For many of them, it was for the very first time. The other image on the slide is of Joseph Brant, and he was the leader of the Six Nations in the War of 1812. There's a beautiful statue of him, which is in Brantford, Ontario, which is also named after him. On the bottom right, there's a small picture of Phil Coate. He has painted a series of beautiful murals under the bridge in the Humber River near Old Mill Station. And the Humber River, because it's a national heritage river of Toronto, of Canada, it was one of the key rivers in the fur trade. And then the last image on the slide is of the indigenous sculpture in Stony Creek Park near Hamilton, and it commemorates the Indigenous role in the Battle of 1812, including, well, the Indigenous troops who fought under Joseph Brant and other Indigenous leaders to ensure that Canada won the war. It has taken 200 years for that Indigenous role to be recognized. Next thing I'm going to talk about is race in the wilderness. And if the people who are visiting the parks, the conservation areas, the eco schools, the forestry programs, or taking part in citizen science projects, if they do not look like the diversity that you see on a typical Toronto subway, then it's a pretty good indication that there are barriers to their participation. Black people are interested in outdoor recreation and in the broader environmentalism, but they do encounter multiple barriers that block their access. Now, when we think of the images of who do we see in environmentalism, whether in the social media, whether it's in the brochures, um, whether it's in any of the reports, whether it's in the newspaper reports, overwhelmingly, when you think of environmentalism, the people that you see represented are white people. And the ones who are absent are Black people. And this creates what some scholars call a visual apartheid. It sends a message that when it comes to environmentalism, it is something that white people do, and they do so in a space, in a white space, and it's a space where Black people are absent. That was the old story prior to last year and COVID. COVID has upended a lot of those discussions around race and representation in the wilderness because of the huge number of people who are discovering in Toronto the ravines and the nearby parks. And those are people of color. Everyone is sick and tired of staring at the four walls, so we have gone out to explore nature. And so people of color are actually going into spaces where before they did not feel welcome, but they're going there anyway in order to escape the four walls. Prior to COVID, for many outdoor recreation clubs and environmental organizations, their membership was aging and falling, and they needed fresh blood. And the fresh blood, the new recruits, would realistically have been people of color, but they were the ones who were not showing up. Again, COVID has changed that. So the sheer number of people of color in the ravines and into outdoor recreation and exploring nature spaces, it does represent an opportunity for traditional environmentalism groups, including forestry, to outreach and to build on that level of interest. They can do that, or are they hoping that somehow once COVID is over that we will go away? On the slide, two pictures. One is of Matthew da Costa, and he's the first recorded Black person in Canadian history. He was here in 1603. We know that he spoke two Indigenous languages, which heavily suggests that he was here in the late 1500s with the French, who were the first to make contact. And on the second image is one of Brown Girl Outdoor World, and it is one of a number of people of color organizations who are forming their own outdoor recreational activities because they're tired of waiting for the white ones to actually notice them or to make them feel welcome. So I'll talk a little bit more about race and outdoor recreation. Black people in general are written out of the history of Canada, and we're also written out of the environmental and outdoor recreation history of the country as well. When we are mentioned in the wilderness history, it's in terms of the trek to freedom via the Underground Railroad. Other than that, we're not present in nature at all. Now, in Carolyn Finney's book, Black Faces, White Spaces, she writes about how hiking and other outdoor recreation activities are coded as things that white people do and in white spaces. and she charts the complicated relationship that Black people have with nature. In Catherine McKittrick's book, Demonic Grounds, she writes about how Black people are seen as out of place in nature. We are meant to be at home in the city among all the concrete, but when it comes to nature, we're seen as out of place. We're seen as a surprise. And both of those books, they're keys to my research because they really examine how race and space, in this case nature, intersect. And the complex history that Black people have with nature. But the bottom line in both of them is the sense that Black people are meant to be in the city, and nature is by default coded as a white space. So when Black people show up there, they're seen as out of place, or for Christian Cooper in Central Park, you're seen as an intruder. On the slide is the picture of Harriet Tubman, and we're used to thinking of her as the person, a conductor on the Underground Railroad, leading the slaves from the US to Canada. Now, my original PhD idea was to actually try and recreate one of her treks because as a hike leader, I was fascinated by a number of things. Like, number one, the slaves would normally run away round about Christmas because they had a few days off and therefore they were less likely to be missed. And they would hike at night. Now, if you think about it, what's the weather like in Canada at Christmas time? And if you're hiking by night, how many of you have tried hiking by night? I've tried hiking by night and it's terrifying. So here you are, you're heading north. Now, what are you wearing? You're heading to minus 20 degrees temperature. How far do you hike each night? Where do you find food? Where do you find shelter? How do you cope with the cold? Those were things that I thought a hike would have, recreating one of her hikes would have answered some of those questions, as well as the bigger issue around how Blackness and nature intersect. And I started my PhD just when Trump got elected. And of course, a Black woman hiking through the woods in the USA in the Trump era, it was not going to happen. And so hence the pivot to look at what was happening here in Canada. The other image on the slide is of Color the Trails, which is an organization which is run by Judith Kasiyama in Vancouver. And this is an organization that is catering to BIPOC women, and it's introducing them to outdoor recreation activities such as skiing and mountain biking. And she's starting several chapters. And again, the key driver for her was the lack of space in the traditional outdoor recreation industry for people of color women. So once again, they're forming their own because it's just easier. They get to do trips on their terms. So the next thing I'll talk about is representation in outdoor recreation. Now, representation does matter. Remember 2 years ago now, that climate crisis or the Davos Climate Crisis Summit, and the photograph that went around the world of the young climate activists. Greta was there, but the photograph that went around the world, one person was cropped out of the group photographs of the young climate activist stars. And that one person was the one Black person. Her name was Vanessa Nakate from Uganda. So cropping her out of the group photograph, the only Black person, it went around the world and it sent the image that once again, when it comes to environmentalism, including the climate crisis discussions, it's a white thing done by white people. And when you look at environmentalism websites, social media sites, look at their magazines, and once again, it is mostly white people that you see featured on those. And this creates a kind of negative feedback loop in outdoor recreation, because if you never see someone like yourself trying an activity, then you're actually less likely to try it. Now, different cultures do have different cognitive maps. That's one of the terms that Carolyn Finney uses. Different cultures do have different cognitive maps to the outdoors. And for Black people, part of our cognitive map to the outdoors is the fear of race-based violence. It's a continuation from the slave catchers and the dogs chasing you through the woods. And as the Christian Cooper incident in Central Park showed, that, yeah, slavery was long ago, but the legacies, the afterlife of slavery, as Sadia Hartman calls it in Lose Your Mother, the afterlife of slavery still shapes the Black experience in outdoor recreation. On the slide are two images. One is of George Bonga, and I love canoeing. And when we think of the fur trade in Canada, the canoe was absolutely critical to the fur trade. The canoe is indigenous technology, though that part tends to be erased, but it's indigenous technology. And the fur trade was the engine of the growth of colonial Canada, the industry here. So we can think of the voyageurs in their canoes paddling up and down the rivers and the lakes of this magnificent country. But very few people think about Black voyageurs, Black fur traders paddling those canoes. And George Bunga was one of those Black fur traders. He left from Montreal, which was the center of the fur trade, paddled to Manitoba. George Bunga was enslaved, and later on, when he was free, he married an Ojibwe woman, and his son, Pierre Bunga, became again another fur trader. And it was Pierre Bunga who signed several treaties with the US government on behalf of the Chippewa in Canada. So on the image, you have George Bunga from the 1880s as a Black fur trader. The next image, I happen to be walking along the Credit River, doing a little project in exploring the Black history of the Credit River. And on the river that day were a father and a son learning how to kayak. Now I'll talk a little bit about social justice in outdoor recreation. Now there are tons of parks and conservation areas within a 1 to 4 hour drive or less in to Toronto. And Toronto is the source of most of the visitors to those places. Now in Toronto, the people of color are the majority of the population. We're anything from 53 to 55. And it will be interesting, as today is the last day for the census, to see how the population shift is going on. So Toronto, people of color are the majority of the population in the city. It is from Toronto that most of the parks and conservation areas, it's the source of their visitors. Yet still, when you go to those parks and conservation areas, how many of the staff are people of color? In my experience, it's something like 90% are white. And so when you look at that system and you show up and you're trying camping for the first time, hiking or canoeing or any of those outdoor recreation activities for the first time, but you show up in those spaces and you don't see anybody who looks like you. Once again, it sends the message that, oh, what are you doing here? You're the surprise. Now, for many of the eco organizations, they have a large number of women on their staff, especially in some of the engineering and more technical positions. And that is absolutely brilliant for gender diversity. But my question is, why is it that most of those women are white? Diversity based on gender, how does that help Black, Indigenous, and other women of color? Our lives are intersectional, where if it's only gender only, then it favors white women. So it's a lack of the intersectional analysis that becomes an issue within those spaces. to get more Black people into the woods, whether it is forestry, whether it's outdoor recreation in terms of camping, hiking, or canoeing, then the environmentalism organizations need to hire people of color on staff, on the frontline staff, so that they're visible. So when people of color show up, there is somebody on the staff who looks like them. Those staff also need to be hired as managers, because as managers, they have insights into different people of color communities. They can come up with strategies and solutions for how to outreach, how to engage, and how to make those communities feel welcome in the wilderness, in the woods. And of course, you also need people of color on the board of directors. And having one person is not going to do the organization any good. One person cannot make change, and that one person risks becoming a token. So it's about, will the organizations embrace this need for equity, diversity, and inclusion from their frontline staff all the way up to the board of directors? On the slide, two images. One is again of Judith Kasiyama of Color the Trails in Vancouver, and gosh, it's that long, 4 years ago now, 4 years ago, Mountain Equipment Co-op, MEC, suddenly discovered diversity. They did a study and found that in almost 20 years of their advertising, they couldn't find a single Black person in any of their ads. And again, in Toronto, people of color are the majority. I've seen more people hiking along Queen Street or Yonge Street in MEC gear than I've seen in either Algonquin or Frontenac parks. And so for MEC, if people of color who are the majority and the younger demographic in Toronto, if they're not buying the gear, who is buying it? And so from a business perspective, MEC suddenly discovering diversity made great business sense. And on the other slide is a little bit more details about what you should know about Black birders. And it's a discussion about how race, or specifically Blackness, and birding intersect. Now, I hope from this presentation that you will see that outdoor recreation is a racialized hobby. It is something that Black people do. Sorry, it is something that white people do, and Black and other people of color don't do it. But how can we change the narrative? Well, for many BIPOC groups, they're not waiting on white organizations to do so. For BIPOC groups, they are organizing using social media, whether it's Black Birders Week, Black Outdoors, or Latino Outdoors. And there's been a huge uptake in this because of the Christian Cooper incident. So when that happened last year, Black Birders rallied around him, and they launched a social media hashtag Black Birders Week. And people who are involved in bird watching went from being the lone Black person bird watching, i.e. my experience, to suddenly finding that there's thousands of Black people who are involved in bird watching. Black Birders Week was phenomenally successful. It really forced the bird watching on the ornithological organizations to, for the first time, I think, talk about the lack of diversity among their ranks. Black Birders Week spawned the Black in Marine Biology, the Black Butterfly Week, the Black in Fishery Week, the whole Black in a whole ton of other stuff week, because the Black people were using the hashtag to find each other. And then other people of color groups started doing the same thing as well. So for conventional environmentalism organizations to encourage or engage with Black people to join their ranks, it means that they have to look at outdoor recreation or access to nature or forestry, whether it's urban forestry, as a social justice issue. Last year as well, because of the Black Lives Matter protests, many organizations decided that the best way to show solidarity with Black Lives Matter was by putting up those black squares on Instagram. Does anybody remember that? Huge flooded activity, but in the in the academy, we'll call that virtue signaling, i.e., it looks good, but it doesn't actually change anything, and it doesn't actually start the discussion on race and the barriers to access for people of color groups. Um, and so, to be effective, going beyond those feel good moments is the path to go. And that means to go down that path means talking about race and talking about social justice. But in the meantime, people of color groups are not waiting around for white organizations to act. They're tired of waiting. And so from the Black Birders Week, a new organization flocked together. One of many that's been formed. That one is specifically around people of color bird watching, and it has taken off. And in Toronto, they're about to open up a chapter because the demand is there from Black and other people of color that we want nature too. But again, it's the barriers that we face. On the slide is an image where Ontario Nature did a whole issue and on diversity in outdoor recreation, and they put a Black woman, Demisha Dennis, on the front cover. And if I remember correctly, it's 50 covers or 50 years, and she was the first Black person ever shown on the cover. And on the slide are some of the hashtags that Black and other people of color are using to find each other. And so the Adventure Gap, Diversify Outdoors are all talking about the lack of representation in outdoor recreation. Now, looking to the future. So COVID, the only good thing that has come out of it is that it has increased the number of Black and other people of color who are visiting nature spaces, and many for the first time. And I've just finished a research project for Nature Canada, which look at a variety of youth of color from 5 different organizations who were exploring nature. And one of the key findings from that report was that for many of them, it's COVID that pushed them to go outside and to explore the ravines. Prior to COVID, the ravines was not seen as a safe space for people who look like them for various reasons. But because of COVID, because of the need to escape the 4 walls, they were stepping out of their comfort zone, going down into the ravines, and absolutely loving it. They want more of the nature. They want to see more people like them leading walks in the ravines. They want to see more picnic spaces in the ravines. Not everyone is necessarily interested in hiking or cycling through the ravine. Some people want to be in the ravine to have a picnic or have a barbecue. So, and given the way COVID is playing out yet again this year, there will be more people of color in the ravines, more pent up demand for access to nature. So we're not going to go away. Outside did a magazine cover 2 years ago where the face of outdoor recreation was a Black woman, i.e., if the outdoor recreation industry wants to thrive, it has to reach out to people of color. And a few years before that, the National Post had done an article where they were asking the question, why is outdoor recreation so white in Canada? And on the left of the slide, my left, was a presentation that my colleague Ambika Tanati and I did. Both of our PhDs are on race and outdoor recreation, and it's an interview with the Globe and Mail. And the comments on the article really underline the gap between what our research is saying and what, for a majority of people, specifically white people, was an issue. For many of them, it was the for many, it was inconceivable for them that people of color were facing so many issues, so many access issues. Some of the comments were around there aren't any barbed wires in the ravines, anybody can go. And it's like, yeah, anybody can go, but prior to COVID, who did you see in the ravines? So, anyway, the article was very, very lively and generated a lot of comments. And the final slide, it's some more contact information, my contact information. And I'll say in closing that Black Lives Matter, the Black Lives Matters protests occurred in virtually every single country in the world. It really highlighted the inequality and the injustice faced by Black people. Now, you add that with COVID, it means the conversations around race are ongoing and they're not going to go away. And that has spilled over into every area of society, including outdoor recreation. Black people are interested in nature, are interested in the wilderness, are interested in the climate crisis debates. We are interested in environmentalism, but we want to be at the table to take part in the conversation. We already know that there is no planet B. And so it's, will the environmentalism sector reach out and build on that, or are they hoping that we will go away? We're not going to go away. We're here. We want to be part of the discussion. Okay, I will stop there, stop sharing my screen, and times for questions,
Thank you.
comments.
Thank you very much, Jacqueline. That was really interesting. And I definitely did not know some of the different groups now that are doing various activities. And I think that's really nice to see. We do have some questions. I also have a question. I will, we first had a comment from Randolph saying that yes, structural changes are needed. That resonated, I think, with quite a few of us. Janet has asked a question. What is the measure of success? Is the ultimate goal to blend all activity groups together? Because if I'm going to frame her question, when we do finally see someone of color on a magazine that has traditionally shown white and mainstream people, we tend to, our eyes pop. We're like, oh, this is new. So it's that reaction is a testament to that this is not something that we're accustomed to. So if you could speak to her question, that would be helpful. Thank you.
The thing is about equity, diversity, and inclusion in outdoor recreation, forestry, or environmentalism, i.e., you need to see people of color from the front lines all the way up. And in some organizations, you do have people of color, but they're the technicians hidden in the back. It's of no use when you show up camping when you don't see anybody who looks like you. And so for environmentalism organization is to step up and actually implement EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion policies that are intersectional, i.e. it's not about women because it's the white women who get those jobs. It's about people of color in general. Once you see us across the entire sector, then we will no longer be a surprise. Then it's like, okay, you want a specialist on forestry? Here's a person of color who's a specialist. It's no big deal. But right now it is a big deal because of the lack of diversity and the lack of representation.
Yeah, thank you. That's cool. Any other questions? Anybody want to unmute? Okay, all right. Well, I had a question. Have you seen in any sort of advances in those structural changes, or are you in your research finding any sort of tangible things that people can do to achieve that change?
I am seeing some changes as in organizations are getting more comfortable talking about race. I'm seeing changes in, like, when I think of an organization like Park People and Nature Canada, both of them are doing exceptional work in terms of talking about race and actually reaching out to diverse communities. Park People in particular are animating the ravines by giving small grants to grassroots people of color organizations for them to lead hikes in the ravines. One of the findings from Ambika's and my research was that people of color feel more comfortable going into the ravines when the hike leaders are people from their own communities. Park People is building capacity within the communities to do that. Nature Canada is raising the issue in terms of policy levels. So yes, I do see changes. I do see a greater awareness. And again, I think the sheer visibility of us in the ravines, um, we're visible in a way that didn't happen prior to COVID. And so again, if you have that number of people visiting the ravines or the provincial parks, then it's a pretty good indicator that there's a pent-up need for these communities to access nature. And organizations are slowly changing, but for a lot of them, they're going to move a lot faster. They have to. Mm-hmm. Again, another summer of COVID, it means a lot more people are going to be in the ravines or in the national parks, provincial parks again. And it cannot be that if you go camping or go hiking, you're going to meet the same white wall of people in terms of the staffing. It's like those organizations have to have learned something from last year. But I do see hope. I do see that, yes, a few organizations are biting the bullet and are reaching out. They are making changes, but it's for the rest of the sector to catch up.
Okay. It looks like Jamie's got his mic off. Unmuted. Would you like to ask a question, Jamie? Oops. Maybe not then.
I would.
Okay, Ali. Okay.
So from a hiring perspective, what verbiage should be used, I guess, in our outreach to, right now, obviously we're saying everybody is welcome to apply, but to encourage people of color and minorities to apply to a job, how do we encourage people to look at our resumes or to send a resume?
That's a good question. And my first response is that you need to have targeted outreach. When you do a general outreach, everybody is welcome. For people of color communities, they are more likely to read that as white. However, you do the targeted outreach. You find out where the people of color scientists, where they're hanging out, who's who on Twitter, who's who on social media within those organizations. Then you send the information to them. That's how you create a potential pool of diverse talent. But you have to do the groundwork in terms of doing the targeted outreach and building relationships. If you don't do that and it's a general advertising, then the chances are it's going to be, oh yeah, another white organization. And then on your social media images, again, who is on your profiles? Who are you showing? Who are your experts on ecology or forestry? If they're not people of color, then again, it's like you're trying to recruit, but everything about your organization is saying it's a white space. It doesn't quite fit. But the targeted outreach, the building relationships with people of color in your industry, that is the way to go. That's how you create your talent pool.
Thank you.
Thank you. So there's Michael Rosen has a question. He's a professional forester and arborist, and as everyone knows, former president of Tree Canada. Welcome, Michael. He's asked a question which you kind of answered, but it's geared more towards a question that's been out there when I was working in forestry as well, that you have people not going into geography of color, and you're not seeing that many Black people in those courses. So how do you encourage, and then obviously forestry and arboriculture as well. So his question is, how would you suggest we begin a strategy to encourage students to enroll in forestry and arboriculture as a career?
One of the key findings there were many key findings that came out of the report that Ambika Tanati and I did for Nature Canada. And we interviewed youth who were roughly 14 to 22. They had a very sophisticated understanding of the climate crisis, environmentalism, and all the issues. But they did not see it as a career because, once again, they hit the white wall. They did not see people of color in those careers. And so, as far as they were concerned, yeah, I'm really interested, but nobody's going to employ me. So, why bother? And so to get more of them in the programs, you may have to do the targeted outreach at the high school level when youth are beginning to make up their minds to say, hey, come on over into forestry geography. These are careers. These are thriving careers that, yeah, you belong here. So it's not an quick fix as in do A, B, C, D and things are going to turn around overnight, but it's about laying the foundation work. For many organizations, you have your citizen science projects. Again, everybody wants to escape COVID. You're going to do those projects, but where is your targeted outreach to say youth of color communities to say, hey, come and take part in this citizen science project with us in the outdoors. We're going to be walking through the woods or whatever. And then once they're engaged there, it's like, yeah, and this can be a career. You're interested in birding, you can actually become a bird scientist. So
Okay.
the targeted outreach is absolutely essential because without that, people of color are not going to respond. And in order to do the targeted outreach, it means building relationships with those communities. And that takes work and it takes time.
All right. And Ricky had asked, you've answered her question there as well. She said, do you think it needs to be more inclusive, or do you think efforts need to be specific to different racialized groups? And I think here she's talking about that cultural differences in maybe communication and also perceptions that you had already addressed. Is there anything you'd like to add to that to answer her question?
Target your outreach. There are many, many different racialized groups in Toronto. Target, build relationships. And I think the thing we often forget is that people of color may be coming from countries where they're already familiar with the climate crisis. They're already familiar with the environmental problems. Yes, the ecology in Canada is different, but if you've been through a flood, you've been through a flood. You know, if you've seen deforestation, you've seen deforestation. It might look, the trees may be different in Canada, but the effects, you know what the effects are. And so, yes, they will have to learn the local ecology, but the principles are the same. There's a whole ton of skills in those communities that is not being utilized. So again, it's about organizations building the relationships and doing the outreach and bringing the skills from those communities to be used here because the skills are there.
Very good. I'm just checking. I saw someone else unmute the, whoops, where did she go? It was, go ahead and speak up. I think I saw it flashed and then it left. Oops. No, she's not there. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Thank you very much, Jacqueline, for your talk. It is a difficult question, as you said. It does make people uncomfortable. Ali also brought that up, that it's hard to address some of the issues. Sometimes people, I think, feel that they don't have the maybe the sensitivity or the language so that they're not offensive. I remember once when I was working, there was an individual that I needed to refer to, and I did say, remember the fellow, he's black. And they said, how dare you use the word black to die, you're being racist. And I was like, but I mean, when you refer to me, I do wear a hijab, and that's fine. I'm comfortable with that. So there are these lines of how that language should be. And I think when we hear you speak, you are comfortable in saying the words that describe things as they are. Like you are saying what you feel, you're expressing how the situation is, you're talking about the research that's out there. Things are not anecdotal, they are repeated over and over. And we really appreciate the work that you are doing. I'm sure that it gets uncomfortable at times. And so, and also for advancing and working for that education for diversity and inclusion. Thank you very much. OUFC is trying to also be educated and to help our peers. And so we appreciate your work and thank you for helping us.
Thank you for having me. And seminars like this is the way forward. It's talking about race, because pretending it's not an issue is not actually not helping anyone. That just falls into the colorblind racism. We don't see race, therefore we don't have a problem. But by talking about it, uncomfortable as it may be for some people, is a first step. Asking questions is a first step. And as I said, there is no planet B. We need to save this planet. We want to be part of that solution. But thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.